Howdy folks, my name is Saoirse and welcome back once again to Flight Sim 2020. So in today's episode we are going to be stepping a little bit further back in time from the heyday of the four-engine airliners in the 50s all the way back to the beginning of passenger aviation here in the mid-30s. It is 1936, we are here at Corpus Christi Airport flying the Lockheed Model 10A Electra once again, this time for Braniff Airways in their flight number 2. Which originated in Brownsville, Texas, going all the way up to Chicago. Now, I was kind of chewing on how to do this episode because when you step this far back in time, you start to run into the problem that these flights took a very long time and they made several different stops because airmail was still the primary way these airlines made money. So they stopped at quite a few places along the way. And so I didn't want it to be just a, takeoff and landing, takeoff and landing, takeoff and landing. That would be a little bit boring. So instead, what we're going to be doing is we're starting at what was stop 2 for this flight here at Corpus Christi. We'll be taking a flight up to San Antonio, which was stop number 3. And then from there, we're going to be flying direct to Fort Worth, which is where passengers on this flight would have changed airplanes for the flight to Chicago. So that's what we're going to be doing today. It's a very hot day today, 96 degrees here at 6:30. There was a pretty intense heat wave at the time, so it's going to affect us a little bit as far as performance. So we'll see how well that shakes out. So let's get this thing started in the air, and I'll see you guys here shortly. Okay, so takeoff looked like it was alright. I did not see any issues pop up, so we should be in pretty good shape for this flight up to San Antonio. And I figured I'd take this time to kind of discuss the equipment that we're using today. So the L-10, or the Model 10 as it was officially called by Lockheed, was not a groundbreaking airplane like the DC-3 would eventually be, but its history is certainly quite unique. It was designed as a twin-engine all-metal improvement of the single-engine wooden Model 9 Orion, which was first introduced in 1931. Now, the Electra was Lockheed's 4th passenger design, since the company was founded in 1926, which started with the highly successful Vega, 1927, most folks know the Vega, and then the Lockheed Air Express in 1928, and then the Orion in 1931. And it used designs and lessons from all these airplanes, but also incorporated designs from Lockheed's single-engine sport planes, such as the Sirius and the Altair. So the Electra was actually developed in a time of very quickly shifting passenger plane technologies. This is something that really kind of defined the 30s in commercial aviation as we know it. Lockheed was really, in a way, just kind of playing catch-up and trying to stay with its competitors. So Boeing actually led the way in 1930 with the development of what it called the M200 monomail, which at the time was using a then unheard of low-wing all-metal design. And then in 1931, the Northrop Alpha hit the market, which is actually developed by John Northrop, who actually was responsible for developing the Vega, so a former Lockheed employee. And then the Orion in that same year, 1931, which featured a retractable landing gear. So there was a lot of really interesting stuff happening really, really quickly. And concerns of safety with these single-engine airplanes actually spurned the development of the twin-engine designs, which were supposed to be safer and faster and just overall better airplanes, which in turn led Boeing to, once again, take the lead with the Model 247 in 1933, and then the Douglas DC-2, and then the Lockheed Electra here in 1934. The Electra actually entered service in 1935, so it was unfortunately at the tail end of all of that. Now, the Electra did not introduce anything new like the 247 or the DC-2. It was really sort of a middling airliner at the time, really. Despite the fact that the 247 and the DC-2 were pretty much it as far as airline options at the time, it wasn't really a great airplane in that respect. But it did have a very impressive pedigree. So this airplane was actually designed by Lloyd Stearman, which, I mean, if you have any knowledge at all of aviation, you know who Lloyd Stearman was. Lloyd Stearman it was Lloyd Stearman and Hall Hibbard, who likewise had a very colorful history in aviation. Both of these men were actually board members of Lockheed at the time, and refinements and wind tunnel work were actually performed by a man by the name of Kelly Johnson, who was a student at the University of Michigan at the time. Johnson's actually the one who was responsible for developing the twin tail design, which eventually became kind of a hallmark of the Lockheed Corporation. Now, Kelly Johnson is probably a name that a lot of you aviation nerds might recognize. He is the man who would eventually head the Skunk Works team for Lockheed, and he was responsible for airplanes like the F-80 Shooting Star, or the F-104 Starfighter, or the SR-71 Blackbird. He's probably the most prolific aircraft designer of all of aviation. Kelly Johnson is responsible for a great deal. And so the fact that he helped design an airplane like the L-10 was sort of, I think, a really defining factor of what made Lockheed so important, certainly back in the mid to late 30s and into the 40s. Now, this variant here, which is the Model 10A, used two Pratt & Whitney R985 Wasp Junior engines. These things produce 450 horsepower apiece, and they were able to get the airplane up to about 170 knots, about 195-ish miles an hour, top speed fully loaded, with a 700 nautical mile or 810-ish mile range. This actually made it slower than most other airliners, but because it was easy to use and it was relatively small, its operating costs were actually much less. So it was a very attractive idea for a lot of up-and-coming airlines at the time. It was also a really popular private charter airliner, so to speak, for European and Asian royals, so much like business jets of this day and age, as well as some European businesses like Beta Shoes and Czechoslovakia. So that is a short history, so to speak, of the Lockheed L-10. It does have a really storied history, despite the fact that it wasn't an amazing airplane. It eventually would turn into the Model 12 Electra Junior, or Junior Electra, and the Model 14 Super Electra, which would then in turn become the Lockheed L-188. So I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about Braniff and the airline that we're flying with today. Now, Braniff has a very interesting history, and it's an airline I don't think a lot of people these days really remember or really know about, because it folded in the early 80s. So we don't really have much knowledge of it these days because, well, it wasn't really a thing. Your parents probably remember it. I certainly remember it, but then again, I'm also a little older, so it's just one of those things. Now, Braniff actually began operating in November of 1930 out of Oklahoma City. It was created by the brothers Thomas and Paul Revere Braniff. That's actually his name, Paul Revere Braniff. And it was actually started after their first airline endeavor, Braniff Airways, had been sold to the Universal Aviation Corporation in 1929. Braniff Airlines would actually be dissolved after Universal was acquired by the Aviation Company, or AVCO, in 1930, which actually this holding company, as they were, actually also held the predecessors to American Airlines. So a bit of a history right there. So Braniff actually started with service between Wichita Falls, Oklahoma City, and Tulsa, Oklahoma, and eventually expanded into St. Louis, Chicago, and Kansas City in 1931 using Lockheed Vegas. Now in 1933, the company actually ceased operations with financial struggles, but it bounced back in 1934 after Braniff's employees agreed to work without pay, and the airline was awarded an airmail route. Now, whether or not they agreed to or were compelled to is sort of lost to history these days. Braniff would actually go on to acquire two Texas-based airlines in 1935 and 1936, with Harmon Airlines in Dallas being the first, and Boeing Airlines in Fort Worth being second. Boeing actually was headquartered at Meacham Field, and they still have a little bit of a history there. So if you ever go to Meacham Field, you'll probably still see some of the remnants floating around out there. Now this would expand Braniff's operations into Texas, and Boeing's own slogan, which was the Great Lakes to the Gulf, because they flew to Chicago, would become Braniff's own slogan. Boeing was primarily, they relied a lot on passenger revenue, and so they were struggling a little bit because all they had were single-engine aircraft, and those airplanes were eventually relegated to Braniff's airmail route, which allowed them to use their prized brand-new L-10 Electras on their passenger service. Braniff would work very closely with the U.S. government in World War II, giving up a bunch of its brand-new DC-3s and all of their DC-2s for the war efforts, turning them into C-47s. I don't remember what the DC-2 was, to be honest, but more transports, basically. They also set up a bunch of training and maintenance facilities at their Dallas Love Field campus, which was a huge boon to the government at the time. Because of this, they were essentially given a really cheery cargo route with the military down to the Panama Canal Zone, which they dubbed the Banana Run. And this Banana Run, as well as Braniff's assistance in the war effort, actually landed them a very significant international route in 1946, which serviced Panama, Ecuador, and Peru, and that would eventually expand into Brazil, Bolivia, Paraguay, and Argentina. And that same year, which was 1948, I believe, Braniff was renamed Braniff International Airways. This was back when the government actually controlled this kind of stuff because of, well, that's just how it was at the time. So being awarded this by the government was a big, big deal. Now through the 50s, Braniff would continue to expand along with its rivals and would enter the jet age with the 707 in 1958, so much like all the other airlines at the time. This was the same year that the airline would eventually move to Dallas with its side of Love Field, because Love Field was their headquarters, so much like Southwest Airlines is today. Now in 1964, despite all of the growth and all the profit that the company was making, it was actually purchased by a holding company called the Great America Corporation. Now Great America's logic was the airline was not aggressive enough, and the jet age would essentially leave them behind, which isn't necessarily true, but at the time that was the thought process. Braniff actually owned all of their airplanes and didn't lease them, which was the common thing at the time, and so Great American thought that they could have the company do some explosive growth, and for a while they did, really. And one of the ways they did this was improving the company's image. Now, anybody who knows or remembers Braniff will likely remember what most people, at least in my family, referred to as the jellybean fleet. So the way that they did this was they painted all of their aircraft in a single bright color. And those colors at the beginning were beige, ochre, orange, turquoise, baby blue, medium blue, lemon yellow, and lavender. So some remarkably bright colors, and this became kind of their trademark throughout the 50s and the 60s. Their flight attendants were decked out in like space age, modern, really futuristic uniforms. The era of the plain plane, as they called it, was effectively over. Matter of fact, one of their airplanes, their only 747 that they had, was painted bright orange, and it was called the Great Pumpkin. It was actually serving in some of their promotional material and their commercials at the time. So because of all these wonderful advancements, Braniff actually did see a bunch of growth through the 60s and 70s, but airline deregulation and executive turmoil in the early 80s really led to its downfall. There was just no backup plan. Braniff didn't have one. And so on May 12th, 1982, exactly one day after CEO Howard Putnam failed to get a court injunction to stop a coming pilot strike, Braniff simply ceased to exist. With a stroke of a pen, it was gone. There was no announcement, no fanfare, no newspaper articles, nothing. It just simply disappeared. Passengers who were waiting on Braniff flights were essentially deplaned and told that the company was no more. It didn't exist anymore. Bye-bye, it's gone. See you later. Find yourself another way. So the very last flight that Braniff ever took was indeed by the Great Pumpkin from Honolulu to Dallas-Fort Worth. So we should be getting into Fort Worth here pretty soon. So I'll sit back and let you guys enjoy the rest of the ride. And here we are in lovely, hot Fort Worth, Texas. Thank you guys so much for joining me on this flight. I had a wonderful time with this, and I hope that you guys did too. I did try really hard to do a bunch of research on this and to try to kind of give you guys a little more in-depth history than what I did with the DC-6 videos. And I'm planning on going back and doing another DC-6 video and sort of digging a little bit deeper into it like I did with this one. I'm certainly open to suggestions though, so if you have an airline you want to know about, or an airplane you want to know about, or a route, or anything like that you want to know about, do let me know. I'll be more than happy to accommodate and do my best to sort of lecture you guys, as it were. I don't know how good of a teacher I am, but I'm doing my very best. This is something I'm really passionate about. So I think that's going to do it for us. Thank you guys so much for joining me. If you do enjoy what I do, please make sure that you like and subscribe. I really do have a good time with these, and I hope that you guys do as well. So that should do it for me from Fort Worth, Texas. My name is Saoirse the Vixen. You guys take care, and I'll see you in the next one.